There was a part of the ship where no one went unless they were ordered to, where the lights flickered just a little too long before turning on, where the metal walls were stained with things you were not supposed to ask about. Kyle Arden had been there 3 times since joining the crew of the Varex Hound, and each time, he left colder. But tonight, something felt different. The corridor hummed with old electricity. Pipes hissed behind the walls. The scent was sharp and sour, like rust mixed with something organic. Kale's boots echoed on the grated floor as he walked deeper, holding a dim lamp in one hand and his breath in the other. He had been sent to fix a power relay. That was the official order. But he already knew the relay wasn't the real reason. Someone wanted him to see what was kept down here. The last door creaked open, slow and reluctant, revealing a wide chamber filled with cages. Storage, they called it. Except nothing in these cages was scrap or gear. Kyle stepped inside, eyes adjusting to the gloom. Most of the cages were empty now, just metal bones and data tags flickering red. But at the far end of the room, one cage still held something. Someone. She sat in the corner of the cell, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped tight around herself. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft pearlescent sheen that pulsed with slow, gentle light. Not bright, not unnatural, just alive. Her hair hung like threads of starlight, long and tangled, falling over a face Kale could barely see. She did not look up. Kale stopped walking. The lamp flickered once. He stepped closer, slow, cautious. No reaction. She was breathing. Barely. Her chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, and the glow beneath her skin moved in time with it. Thin lines of silver light traced along her arms and neck like soft circuitry. Her eyes opened, and met his. They were not human, but they were not strange. They were endless. And silent. Kale's hand lowered instinctively, not in fear. In respect. He had seen prisoners before. He had seen creatures locked in cells for being too dangerous, too rare, too different. But this was not rage, not madness. It was grief. A silent grief so deep it pulled something inside him loose. He checked the tag on the cage. No name. Just one word. Prize. He turned back to her. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. She didn't respond, didn't blink, just kept watching. Kyle looked around the room. No cameras, no guards, no witnesses. Something twisted in his gut. He stepped to the lock. A simple magnetic grid. Standard security. One swipe from his ID chip and it would disengage. But if he did that, he'd be marked. The system would know. She still said nothing. But her eyes, those starlit eyes, seemed to ask something. Not for help, for choice. "Will you?" Kale reached for the lock, paused. He had never been the kind of man who broke protocol. He followed orders, stayed quiet, stayed in the shadows. But tonight, something inside the cage made the silence louder. He tapped his ID to the panel. The lock released with a low click. The door slid open. She didn't move, didn't run. She just breathed. And in that breath, Kale felt something shift in the air. The ship creaked above them. The lights flickered again. And deep inside the metal bones of the Varex Hound, something ancient woke up. The door slid open with a hiss so soft it was almost a sigh. For a moment, nothing moved. The girl, Sci-Fi, remained where she was, crouched low in the cage as if her body hadn't quite caught up to the idea that the lock was gone. Kale stood just outside the threshold, his hand still on the panel. He didn't say anything, didn't urge her. He just waited. Then, without a word, Sci-Fi moved. She rose to her feet with unnatural grace, her motions fluid and silent, like she had practiced being invisible. The cage's door remained open. She stepped through it. Bare feet touched the cold metal floor with no sound at all. Kale took a slow breath. "Do you understand me?" She nodded once. "Can you run?" Another nod. Kale handed her a loose utility cloak from the wall, thin, ragged, but better than nothing. She took it without hesitation and wrapped it around her shoulders, hiding the glow beneath her skin. Her antennae, thin silver filaments tucked behind her ears, flattened, as if reacting to the tension in the air. Kyle turned to the hallway. "Follow close, no sound. We go through maintenance." She followed. They moved fast, slipping through dim corridors lit by emergency strips and the occasional flickering overhead bulb. Kyle led the way, bypassing security cams by muscle memory, ducking through access panels and empty ventways. He knew the bones of the ship better than most. That's what happened when no one talked to you. You learned the quiet places. Sci-Fi never stumbled, never asked questions. She moved like she had walked these same paths in a dream. Behind them, the ship groaned. A soft pulse buzzed in Kale's earpiece. System breach detected. The cage's release had triggered a silent alarm. He muttered a curse and picked up the pace. They reached the first junction, a narrow shaft used for venting coolant. Kyle opened the hatch and climbed through, motioning for her to follow. She didn't hesitate. Inside the shaft, the air was thicker, laced with the scent of oil and ozone. "You're calm," Kyle said as they crawled. Most would be panicking. Sci-Fi's voice came at last, not through words but through presence, a feeling, a thought that brushed the edge of his mind like wind against glass. "I've escaped before." He flinched. "You speak?" She glanced back at him, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Only when necessary." Kyle didn't ask how he heard her without sound. He didn't want to question it yet. There would be time for that, if they lived. They exited into a decommissioned engine bay, cold, hollow, walls rusted with time. It was the perfect hiding spot. Kyle sealed the door behind them and activated a sound-canceling field around the room. Not perfect, but it would buy them a few minutes. Sci-Fi moved to the corner and crouched again, folding into herself like she was practiced at vanishing even in plain sight. Kale leaned against the bulkhead, heartbeat still hammering. "Do you know why they had you locked up?" She looked at him. Then slowly, deliberately, placed her hand against her own chest. "Because I remember things they want forgotten." Kale stared at her. The lights in the room dimmed slightly, power rerouting. The ship knew something was off. "We need a plan," he muttered. Sci-Fi turned toward the wall, her hand brushing the metal. She closed her eyes, then looked back. "They will come. Not just for me. For anyone who saw me free." "You mean me?" She nodded. Kale let out a slow breath. "Then I guess we're both outlaws now." A silence passed between them. Then Sci-Fi did something unexpected. She reached toward him, not to touch, but to share. And suddenly, Kale saw something, just a flash. A world of glass and sky. A place torn apart by war, by fear. A girl running through fields that no longer bloomed. A cage being lowered. A voice whispering, "Stay quiet, and they won't break you completely." He blinked, staggered back. She looked away. "I'm sorry," he said. She didn't reply, didn't need to. Outside, distant footsteps echoed through the maintenance hall. Kale picked up the old shock baton from the floor. It barely had enough charge for one shot. He looked at her. "You ready?" She stood, eyes glowing. Not afraid. "Yes." The abandoned engine bay flickered under dying emergency lights, casting long, uneven shadows that seemed to breathe on the walls. Pipes hissed. Somewhere far above, the metal ribs of the Virex Hound groaned under gravitational drift. The ship was alive in all the wrong ways. Kyle paced. Sci-Fi sat. She hadn't moved since they'd sealed the room. Curled into herself again, hood pulled low over her face. She looked like a ghost waiting for a reason not to disappear. Kale checked the door seal again. Then again. Then again. Silence. He turned. "We need to keep moving." No answer. He crouched beside her. "I don't know what they were doing to you. I don't know what you are, but I do know the captain won't stop. If they caught you once, they'll find a way to do it again." Still nothing. Kyle clenched his jaw, sat beside her, leaned his head against the wall. "I should have kept walking," he said softly. "I should have reported it. Followed orders. Let someone else decide what to do with you." Seifi's head turned slightly toward him. "But I didn't," he went on. "Because you didn't scream. You didn't beg. You just looked at me. And I knew." He looked at her now, really looked. "You were never the prize. You were the warning." A long silence. Then, a flicker of light danced along her skin. Not like before. This one was sharp, like a reaction. Her eyes lifted just slightly, and she stared at him with something between surprise and sorrow. Then she whispered, "Thank you." Kyle froze. The words were quiet, rough, not quite fluent, but real. "You speak," he said, barely believing it. Seifi nodded slowly. "Only when it matters?" Kyle exhaled. "And this matters?" She turned her face toward the floor. "You saw me, not what I was. Just me." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Seifi uncurled, shifting slowly. Her fingers brushed a panel on the wall, an old data relay no longer in service. She placed her hand flat against it, closed her eyes. The panel flickered to life. Kyle's eyes widened. "You can interface with the ship?" "No," she murmured. "The ship can interface with me." Lines of light ran from her fingertips into the relay, illuminating a burst of ancient symbols across the wall. They weren't in any known language, but Kale understood something in the rhythm. Like math made of memory. "What is that?" he asked. Seifi's voice dropped low. "A map. But not for where we are. For what we were." Kyle leaned in. "Show me." She hesitated, then removed a small glass-like crystal from a pocket hidden inside her cloak. It shimmered even without light. She placed it into the port beside the relay. The symbols changed. A star field appeared, hundreds of pinpricks moving in motion. At the center, a single world pulsed. "This was home," she whispered. Kale looked at her. "Was?" They erased it, not with weapons. With silence, he swallowed. "You're the last," she nodded. Kale didn't ask what it felt like. He didn't need to. He had spent years aboard this ship not being seen, not being chosen, not being remembered. He understood more than he wanted to admit. The crystal pulsed again, and then shattered. Seifi flinched. Kale grabbed her wrist. "What happened?" "They found the signal," she said. "We don't have time." A klaxon blared overhead, soft, distant. A signal only someone who knew the ship well would recognize. Containment breach, Section 7. They were on the move. Kale stood. "We run!" Seifi stood too, but she was staring at the wall, at the fragments of the broken crystal. "They'll keep coming," she said, "even if we escape this ship. Then we make sure they don't catch us." She looked at him, eyes shimmering. "And if they do?" Cal gripped the old shock baton tighter. "Then I make sure they regret it." The corridor beyond the old engine bay had changed. It was darker now, quieter. Not the kind of quiet that meant safety, but the kind that felt like holding your breath just before a door slammed shut. Kyle led the way, moving fast but careful, his eyes scanning every flicker of movement, every sudden gust from the vents. Seifi followed close behind, her cloak drawn tight, glow barely visible. But her presence was sharp, like the air shifted around her, bent to make space. She didn't breathe heavy, she didn't stumble. But Kyle could tell she was listening, not for footsteps, for them. Valric Tane, captain of the Virex Hound, had given the order. Kyle knew how that worked. He'd seen it before, on forgotten moons, in dead zones where rules were flexible and silence bought profit. The command went out quietly. No alarms, no squads, just one tracker, a hunter. And once the hunter was released, no one spoke of it again. Kale turned left into an auxiliary conduit, ducked under a half-collapsed support beam, then stopped. Seifi froze beside him. Someone was already waiting. Not a crewman. The figure stepped from the shadows, draped in a dark exo-rig with armor that seemed to drink in the light. No insignia, No rank. Just a full helmet with a single red slit running from crown to jaw. In its hand was a pulse weapon that pulsed with a low whine, charged, waiting. Kale raised his hand slowly. "We're not armed." The figure didn't move. Then a voice, distorted, metallic. "Return the anomaly." Sci-Fi stepped behind Kale. Kale kept his voice calm. "She's not an anomaly, she's a person. No designation, no species match, no origin file. She is property until proven otherwise." Kale's jaw clenched. "She's not yours." The hunter raised the pulse weapon. Sci-Fi moved. No sound. Just light. A flash of gold and silver lanced from her hand. Not violent, not explosive. Just pressure. Like gravity shifted for a second. The hunter staggered back. Not thrown, but disoriented. The pulse weapon discharged, but the shot went wide, slamming into the wall with a crack of heat. Kale lunged, tackled the hunter at the waist, slammed him against the floor. The impact jarred Kale's shoulder, but he rolled fast, grabbed the weapon and tossed it down the corridor. The hunter kicked hard, sending Kale into the wall. Sci-Fi stepped forward. Her eyes glowed now, brighter than before. She raised both hands, palms open. The air thickened. The hunter tried to rise, but his suit hissed, lights flickering. He collapsed, writhing. Then, stillness. Kale gasped for breath. "What did you—" "Disrupted the interface," Sci-Fi said. "His suit thinks he's already dead." Kale stared at her. She looked back, calm but trembling. "It won't last. We need to move." They ran. Through conduits and bypass routes Kale had memorized in years of maintenance. Behind them, lights flickered. Systems rebooted. Alarms stayed off. But the hunter wouldn't be the only one. Kale knew Valric. He wouldn't stop at one. They reached a cargo service shaft, sealed, rusted, barely functional. Kale started working the panel. "This leads to the shuttle ring." "If we get there," Sci-Fi asked, "what then?" Kale looked at her. "I don't know, but we don't stop here." She touched his shoulder. He froze. And in that instant, he felt her. Not words, not thoughts. Just her. Her fear, her hope, her exhaustion, her belief in him. Then it was gone. He opened the hatch. They crawled through darkness. Behind them, in the distance, the hunter stood once more. And this time, he wasn't alone. The crawl space opened into an old maintenance bay sealed off since the last deck purge. The lights barely worked. Dust floated like ghosts in the air, and the walls groaned with age and memory. Kyle and Sci-Fi stepped inside, breathless, hearts pounding. Not just from running, but from knowing this might be the last place they had to hide. Kyle sealed the door manually, cutting the circuit before the ship's AI could log their position. No automatic systems, no tracking, just analog bolts and silence. Sci-Fi sat down against the far wall, folding her legs beneath her like she had done it for centuries. Her skin no longer glowed. She looked drained, but calm. Kale crouched in front of her. "I need to know what you are," he said softly. "No more guesses. No more running blind." Sci-Fi looked up at him and nodded. She raised her hand, slow, steady, and touched the wall beside her. A soft pulse of light spread outward, forming a shifting sphere that hovered between them. It looked like a star chart, but older, deeper, like a memory trying to remember itself. "You think I am rare," she began. Her voice was quiet, measured. "But I am not alone. I am a piece of something broken, something ancient, something called the balance seed." Kale frowned. "Balance of what?" She looked into his eyes. "Of everything." The projection shifted. Galaxies spun. Worlds bloomed and faded. Then a figure appeared. Not Sci-Fi, but something like her. Surrounded by beings of fire, mist, and light. "The universe was once held in rhythm," she said. "Kept in check by minds not born of planets but of purpose. We were not rulers. We were bridges. Carriers of thought between worlds, between species, between chaos and calm." The image flickered. Explosions, war, silhouettes burning. But the universe feared what it could not control, so it severed its own bridges, turned messengers into myths, and balance into silence. Kale stared at her. You're saying you were part of something made to keep the galaxy stable? She nodded. And now that it's gone, he said, everything's falling apart. Sci-Fi closed her eyes. I was locked away because I remembered. Because I still carry a fragment of that rhythm. Kyle stood, turning away for a moment. And the captain knew? Not what I was. Just that I was valuable. That someone out there would kill to claim me. Or to keep me hidden. Kyle turned back, voice low. Why did you let me open the cage? Sci-Fi hesitated. Then said, because you didn't ask who I was. You asked if I could run. Kyle exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. So what now? You go back to wherever your kind came from? Rebuild this balance? She shook her head. There is no my kind anymore. I am the last functional carrier, the last vessel. Kyle's voice cracked. Then why aren't you running again? Sci-Fi looked at him. Steady. Software. Because you made me want to stay. The projection dissolved. She leaned forward. If they find me again, they will erase not just my body, but my memory, my purpose. That's what they do. They erase what doesn't obey. Kale's hands curled into fists. They won't touch you, not while I'm breathing. A beat. Then her voice lowered. Would you give your breath for me? He didn't answer right away, then stepped closer. Took her hand. Yes. She closed her eyes. And for the first time since he found her, her glow returned. Brighter. Warmer. Like belief had reignited something even her energy couldn't reach alone. The moment held. Then, the door vibrated, a sharp ping, then another. Kale stood. They've found us. Sci-Fi rose beside him, light humming around her skin. Kale grinned, dark and certain. Then let's remind them what balance feels like. The hatch shuddered under impact. Metal groaned. A soft, high-pitched alarm began to pulse through the bay, low enough to slip beneath thought, but sharp enough to rattle nerves. Kyle stared at the door. 2 inches of durasteel, reinforced. It wouldn't last more than 60 seconds. Sci-Fi stood beside him, calm. Can you open a way out? Kale asked, voice tight. Yes, she said. But, he prompted. She turned toward the far wall and raised her hand. Light gathered in her palm. Not blinding, but dense, like the memory of a star folding in on itself. Lines of gold and silver traced along her arm, connecting to the air itself. Opening a gate from here, she said softly, means bending the ship. And when you bend something unnatural long enough, it breaks, Kale finished. Sci-Fi nodded. The door behind them slammed again. Sparks sprayed from the edges. Kale grabbed a piece of piping and jammed it into the internal lock. Do it. We'll deal with the consequences on the other side. Sci-Fi stepped forward. She placed her hand against the wall and whispered something Kale couldn't hear. Not with ears, but with skin. The air split. Not like a door, like a wound. A vertical slash opened in the center of the chamber, flickering and stuttering like it wasn't supposed to exist. Through the tear, Kale saw nothing. Not black, not stars. Just a void, layered, echoing, pulsing like a heartbeat stretched across dimensions. He took a step back. That's your escape? Sci-Fi looked at him. That's the in-between, not quite space, not quite time. It's where those who carry memory pass through when there's nowhere else left. He looked into the gate again. That doesn't look like somewhere we're meant to be. It's not. The door behind them exploded inward. Kyle didn't wait. He grabbed Sci-Fi's hand, and they jumped. There was no falling, no wind, just absence. Kyle felt his body stretch, not physically, but like thoughts were pulled long and thin, strung across the silence. He couldn't hear Sci-Fi, but he could feel her beside him, anchored, pulsing like a fixed star. Then sound. Low. Vibrating. like an ancient chorus made of metal and light. Shapes formed in the distance. Silhouettes, tall, wrapped in long cloaks that moved without wind. Their faces were hidden, not masked, just unseen. Sci-Fi gasped beside him. "They're real," she whispered. Kale found his voice. "Who?" She stepped forward. "The Guardians of the Rift." The figures moved closer. Kale reached for Sci-Fi, but they didn't attack, didn't threaten. They only observed. Then one of them raised a hand. From beneath its robe, a small object floated forward, a prism of shifting geometry, pulsing faint blue. "You unlocked the fragment," it said, not aloud, but in his head. Not a voice, a presence. Sci-Fi stepped between Kale and the Guardian. "I didn't come here to offer it back." "You don't own it," the voice replied. "I carry it," she said. "And this one?" The Guardian turned toward Kale. "He is not marked." "He chose," Sci-Fi answered. "Then he shares the cost." Kale stepped forward. "What cost?" The rift around them pulsed. "You crossed a gate never meant for humans," the Guardian said. "You touched the old memory. You woke a light that demands balance. That light must be placed or it will consume." "Placed where?" Kale asked. "In her. Or in you." Sci-Fi turned sharply. "No, you're not two anymore," the voice said. "You are bond, and bond divides nothing. It only transfers." Kale looked at Sci-Fi. "You knew this." She nodded, slow. "I didn't think we'd make it this far." The Guardians stepped back. A gate shimmered into view behind them, gentler this time, clearer. "This door leads forward," the voice said. "If you pass through it together, you are changed forever. The universe will feel your bond. It will shift around you." "And if we don't?" Kale asked. "This moment ends, and the hunt resumes." Silence. Kyle turned to Sci-Fi. "Do we step through?" Her eyes shimmered. "Yes," she said. "Because for the first time, I want to be seen. Not remembered, not worshipped, just seen." He held out his hand. She took it. And together, they walked into the gate, not to escape, but to become. The world beyond the gate was not a place. It was a question. Kale and Sci-Fi stood on a platform suspended over an endless cascade of light and time, where stars bloomed and collapsed like breathing. The sky, or what passed for it, shifted colors in slow, emotional waves, reacting not to weather, but to presence. They were not alone. The Guardians of the Rift surrounded them, silent as monoliths. Their robes shimmered with fragments of memory, glimpses of worlds long extinguished, lives unlived, moments undone. Each one carried no face, no voice, but Kale could feel them thinking. Judging. Waiting. A voice, not loud, but everywhere at once, spoke without sound. "You crossed a forbidden threshold." Kale looked around but saw no mouth, no eyes. Just expectation pressing into his chest. "You freed the carrier. You awakened the bond. You exposed the balance seed to the unstable present." "Explain." Kale stepped forward, unsure if it mattered, but needing to speak. "She was in a cage," he said. "That's all I knew, and I opened the lock." "Why?" "Because no one should stay caged." Silence. Then the voice turned to Sci-Fi. "You are the seed, the tether, the memory they buried. Do you accept the awakening?" Sci-Fi raised her chin. Her glow returned slowly, threads of silver and gold weaving across her skin like a language too ancient for words. "I didn't ask for this," she said, "but I accept it, and I claim it. I am no longer a vessel. I am the voice." The Guardians shifted. One stepped forward, lifting a hand. In its palm appeared a thin sliver of light, sharp and flickering. A blade of memory. Then, complete the alignment. Let the balance settle. Transfer the anchor, or lose the bond. Kyle frowned. "What does that mean?" Sci-Fi turned to him. Her eyes shimmered. "They want me to pass it," she said. "The energy that binds the balance seed. It cannot live in both of us now. It must choose." Kale felt something stir inside his chest. A pressure. A warmth. He realized. He had touched it. carried a piece of it. When he opened the cage, when he didn't run, he was marked. "What happens if I take it?" he asked. "You stop being just you," Sci-Fi said. "You become part of the rhythm, the memory, the weight. And if you keep it, I lose myself to it. I won't be Sci-Fi anymore. I'll be function." Kyle looked into her eyes and smiled. "Then we share it." The guardian stirred. The blade shimmered brighter. "The bond cannot divide." "Then the bond becomes something new," Kale said. He reached for her hand. Sci-Fi hesitated, then took it. The moment they touched, the world cracked. Light burst from the platform, pure, harmonic, impossible to hold. The sky trembled. The guardian stepped back, not in protest, in recognition. Sci-Fi and Kale rose into the air, surrounded by swirling memory. Fragments of lost worlds, broken truths, forgotten names, all spinning around them like stardust seeking gravity. Kale felt her thoughts in his. Not words. "I don't want to disappear." His answer came without speaking. "Then stay." The blade of memory dissolved. The light settled. And when they landed, they were not the same. The guardians bowed, not in surrender but in acknowledgement. The balance accepts. A new gate opened. Behind it, reality, the Virex hound, the ship, the corridors, the hunt. But they were not hunted anymore. Kale looked at Sci-Fi. "Ready?" She smiled. "Not to run, to begin." And together, they stepped through, not as prisoner and rescuer, not as alien and human, but as bond. The gate sealed behind them without a sound. One breath they were standing on a platform woven from memory and starlight. The next, they were back on the Virex hound. Same metal floor. Same narrow corridor. Same cold air humming through recycled vents. But nothing felt the same. Kyle looked around, gripping the wall for balance. The silence of the ship returned, heavy and indifferent, as if no one would ever know what had just happened. As if the entire universe had held its breath, and now exhaled. Sci-Fi stood beside him. Her light was quieter now. Not gone, not hidden, just integrated. Like it no longer needed to shine to prove it existed. They moved quickly but calmly, weaving through shadowed halls and maintenance shafts. There was no chase, no alarm, no resistance, not because the crew had stood down, but because the ship felt them now. Doors opened before they touched them. Lights flickered just a moment longer to guide them. The air vents slowed as they passed. Everything responded, not to their words but to their presence. Kyle knew this feeling. Respect, fear, reverence. They reached the shuttle bay without a single word spoken. One vessel remained docked at the far end. Small, fast, untouched. Kale turned to Sci-Fi. "You sure?" She looked at him. "No." He smiled. "Good. Me neither." They stepped inside. The controls lit up before he touched them. Sci-Fi sat in the co-pilot seat, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the console. She wasn't interfacing. Just being there was enough. Kale started the engines. The bay doors opened. As the shuttle pulled free of the Virex hound, he looked back at the ship that had caged her, had shaped him, had tried to define them both. It shrank in the distance. Sci-Fi spoke, her voice steady and soft. "They'll come looking." Kyle nodded. "Let them." "What will we tell them if they ask who we are?" He thought about it, then answered. "We're the ones who chose to open the door, and didn't flinch when something real walked through it." The stars stretched before them, infinite and silent. But the silence no longer felt like an absence. It felt like invitation. Sci-Fi leaned back in her seat, eyes half closed. "Kale," she whispered, "thank you." He didn't look at her. He just reached out and took her hand. They didn't need a destination, because what came next was theirs to decide. What if freedom was never the escape, but the moment someone looked at you and didn't see a threat or a mystery, but a choice? Would you walk into the unknown with someone who saw you before you even spoke? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes what comes next isn't fate, it's you.